Chapter 41. Monkey Business. After getting any thoughts of a WWF run out of my system, I once again became completely focused on the Texas scene. Since my plans of creating a monster for Hulk Hogan to slay had been thwarted, I channeled that energy into creating a monster for the Von Erich boys to slay. I thought it would be unique to bring a new wrestler into Texas, claim he was from my neighborhood back in Chicago, and tell stories about how we used to run together in a street gang. At the time, Kerry Von Erich was being billed as the modern-day warrior, so I thought it would be cool to have a warrior versus warrior feud. Therefore, I decided to name my new creation the Halstead Street Warrior. I also really wanted to give the impression that he and I were tight, so I had to come up with a nickname for him. I'm a big fan of Creedence Clearwater Revival, and one of my favorite songs is Bad Moon Rising. I was listening to that song one day as I was falling asleep. When I woke up, the tape had looped and was playing again. That's when it hit me his nickname would be Moon. Knowing it would be important to bring the right guy in for this role, I remembered a young wrestler I had co-managed, along with Sir Oliver Humperdinck when we ran Hand H Limited in North Carolina, named the One Man Gang. I knew he would be a perfect Halstead Street Warrior, so I immediately recruited him into Texas. At the time, the One Man Gang had long hair and wore tights, so I had to repackage him and change his persona in order to get the look I was envisioning. With his blessings, I shaved off the sides of his head, leaving just a mohawk. I also got him a denim jacket with the Halstead Street Warrior written on the back, wrapped a bandana around his head, and instructed him to carry a chain to the ring. Even though he was still going to be billed as the One Man Gang, I explained to him that I wanted to give the impression that we were longtime friends from our gang days, so when we talked back and forth on interviews, you're Moon and I'm Slick. To top it off, I came up with this harebrained idea that he should get two skulls tattooed on each side of his head, one with Kevin's name, and the other with Kerry's name. Amazingly, the One Man Gang agreed to do it, which I thought was very brave on his part. We went to a tattoo artist friend of mine and the One Man Gang patiently sat there for 3 hours while my friend drilled those Von Erich names into his head, an hour and a half for each side of his head. Then, during his interviews, not only would he talk about what he was going to do to the Von Erichs, but he would point at the skulls on his head, as well. It was so subtle, but so powerful at the same time. A guy like Bam Bam Bigelow had his whole head tattooed, and because of that they were more or less not noticed. However, with just two skulls with Kevin and Kerry's names on it, the One Man Gang's tattoos had a real big impact. I think that of all the gimmicks I ever developed, that was one of my all-time favorites. With his theme song, Bad Moon Rising by Creedence Clearwater Revival, the One Man Gang got over big time and was a perfect opponent for Kerry. On May 5, 1985, we took their feud to Texas Stadium for the second annual David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions. Over 26,000 people showed up that day to see them wrestle in a match, with the stipulation being that if Kerry beat the One Man Gang, I would have my head shaved for the second time, and this time it would be for life. The first time I shaved my head it was for 90 days, and I actually kept it shaved until I left Texas in 1983. I started growing my hair back out in North Carolina, because if you recall, I was going to lose my hair there with Jimmy Valiant. However, the Great Kabuki and I broke up before that could happen, so I was happy to lose it in a match against Kerry. After beating the One Man Gang, Kerry shaved my head in the middle of the ring, and I've kept it shaved ever since. One thing I noticed upon my return to Texas was an overall atmosphere change from when I was the booker, and that the Texas booking office was no longer a tight, clean ship. Specifically, there was a real liberal attitude when it came to allowing drugs into the dressing room. Every Monday night at the Will Rogers Coliseum, I saw a line at the attending physician's door where he was dispensing prescription medication. The guys would get prescription medication for aches and pains like any other athlete would. They had sore muscles and needed to relax so they could get a good night's sleep and be able to wrestle 30 times a month. Most of the guys took the pills, managed their intake, used the medication until their injury was better, and would then get off of them. Some of the guys, however, got addicted to prescription medication and would do anything to get their hands on it. I saw Gino Hernandez ask doctors to burn moles off his back at the arena just so he could get prescription medication. This was not even a year after David Von Erich had died of an accidental drug overdose on prescription medication. I also saw guys who had been in line for prescription medication at the Will Rogers Coliseum line up later that week to meet with the attending physician in El Paso. They were getting their medication twice a week. As disturbing as those things were to me, no one else seemed to think there was anything wrong with that. Perhaps that was because it was just prescription medication, which was deemed acceptable in the 1980s. Prescription medication came from an esteemed, educated doctor in a white coat. Prescription medication was endorsed by the American Medical Association. Prescription medication was seen as very helpful in curing aches and pains so that people could sleep at night or work with pain. Prescription medication seemingly cured everything. If someone was too fat, a doctor would put them on drugs to lose weight. If someone had insomnia, they would take some prescribed medication in order to sleep. Taking pills to cure what ails you was par for the course back then. Nancy Reagan started Just Say No, but she was saying no to street drugs. No one was saying no to prescription medication. Nobody seemed to look at prescription medication as dangerous drugs, but I did. The guys in Texas who were taking the prescription medication definitely didn't see themselves as drug addicts. The way they saw it, it wasn't like they were going down into the hood to get their fix. They were going to the doctor and getting their medication under his watchful eye. Unfortunately, certain guys got addicted to prescription medication and it messed up their lives. Now I'm not saying that some of the guys didn't have a coke binge here or there, but it all started with prescription medication. Plus, keep in mind these guys were young. No matter how determined they might have been in the beginning to avoid cocaine, after a while, they couldn't keep saying no. They were so young and so over, that every party they went to they were the guest of honor, and people were constantly putting something in their hand or up their nose, and before they knew it, they got into the drug scene. It wasn't anybody's fault, it was just the times. However, what I said about prescription medication earlier also applies to cocaine. Some guys were able to do recreational coke and never get strung out on it, and some guys got hooked on it. When I got involved in the wrestling business in 1958, the great addiction was alcohol. By the 70s, marijuana became popular, and in the 80s, prescription medication and cocaine became in vogue. That's with any sport, though, whether it was wrestling, football, or baseball. In fact, cocaine became so popular in the 80s that it actually hurt marijuana sales. I don't want to make it seem as if the entire dressing room was like Animal House, where everyone on the roster was going wild. Many of the guys wouldn't touch drugs. Take Bruiser Brody, for example. Sure, he might smoke a number occasionally, but he wasn't putting coke up his nose or throwing pills down his throat. However, the drug scene did concern me, and one thing that drove me crazy was when wrestlers would show up for work high. There was one occasion in Fort Worth where Kerry and Gino showed up and it was clear they were in no condition to perform. Even though I wasn't the booker, I was their friend, and I was very hard on them that night. I told them how disappointed and upset I was with them. I also told them that they were disrespectful, not only to the business, but also to their opponents who they were scheduled to wrestle that night. I became so concerned with how out of control the prescription drug situation had become in the dressing room that I confronted the attending physician one night and asked, "Don't you think it would be proper that if these guys want prescriptions they should make an office visit?" He didn't even answer me. He just gave me a look like who was I to tell him what to do. So I went to Fritz and told him, "A lot of the guys are using the attending physician as their personal chemist. I strongly suggest you talk to him and have him cut this out." Apparently, Fritz did talk to him, and after that, if any of the guys wanted prescription medication, they had to make an appointment and go to a doctor's office. That made it more difficult for them to get medication, and was an added inconvenience. I certainly don't want you to think that it ended their growing dependency on prescription medication, because, unfortunately, it didn't. The weird thing was that there was a sort of hypocrisy going on. As doctors were handing out drugs in the back, Fritz went on TV and introduced his hunting buddy, the Reverend Gary Holder, as the chaplain for the promotion. Now I hate to question people's faith, especially those who flaunt it, but I found that reprehensible. All of us, in one way or another, have some contact with a higher being, but to bring a preacher on a wrestling program and endorse him seemed like camouflage to me. Fritz did a lot of things I didn't agree with, though. I have my own code of morality, and having a chaplain for the territory didn't fit that code. I think that a relationship with God is a very personal thing. Fritz went to church, professed to be a good Christian, and did all the Christianly things that one would think a Christian would do. However, was Fritz a good Christian, and did his religion help him get through all the tragedy and hurt that he went through? I don't know, but I hope so. In 1985, Fritz made another surprising move by signing a talent trading deal with Antonio Inoki and New Japan Wrestling, after having been associated with Giant Baba and All Japan for years. At the time, New Japan and All Japan were in an extremely heated war in Japan, so Fritz's defection was truly shocking. After all they had been through together over the years, especially in dealing with David's death in Japan, Fritz left Baba for a few dollars more. That's all it was in the end, more money for the compound. I also noticed that business wasn't as good as it was when I had left, and realized that Ken Mantell wasn't that strong of a booker. And for those of you that think that since Texas wrestling was on fire in 1983, and he was the booker that he must be good, keep in mind that when I left in January of 1983, I had just brought in the fabulous Freebirds and set up their feud with the Von Erichs. With the stable of talent and the angle set up that I left the territory with, anyone could have come in and booked Texas. Ken Mantell was in the right place at the right time and simply ran the company based on the Christmas night 1982 angle that I had booked. And that's not just sour grapes on my part, it's a fact. And if it sounds like I'm taking too much credit for the big run in 1983, keep in mind that I literally recruited the talent and set up the angles. Just because I was in the Carolinas while my angles played out does not negate my contribution to the success of the territory. It's just like when Jimmy Johnson left his position as head coach of the Dallas Cowboys in 1994, and then Barry Switzer came in and led the team, who Jimmy Johnson had recruited, to the Super Bowl in 1996. Is it the coach that drafts the players or the coach who inherits them? Barry Switzer's abilities soon became exposed, because after 1996 it was all downhill for the Cowboys, even to this day. And just like Barry Switzer couldn't maintain his success with the team he inherited, as soon as the fabulous Freebirds left the territory, business started to go down in Texas, and Ken Mantell couldn't switch it and make it go back up. At that point, the chinks in his armor really started to show. As things were crumbling around him, the only thing Ken seemed interested in was deciding what kind of banner should be around the ring and what color shirts the referees should wear. Those were his priorities. He also felt it was worth it to go out and spend $1,500 to fly Sunshine into the Cotton Bowl in a helicopter. One thing he spent an inordinate amount of time figuring out was what kinds of dresses the valets should wear. I have heard it said that Ken Mantell became famous because of the way he utilized the valets and got them involved in matches, as if that was his big contribution to our industry. The last time I checked, valets had been around since the days of Gorgeous George, and women's wrestling was around long before that. Another way I have heard people define Ken's booking style is that he was heavy on heel versus heel matches, as if he created that concept, as well. Heel versus heel matches were a Texas staple and goes back to Danny McShane versus Wild Red Berry, Bull Curry versus Duke Kiyomaka, Fritz and Waldo von Erich versus Al Costello and Carl von Bronner, Killer Carl Cox versus Duke Kiyomaka, Mark Lewin versus Toru Tanaka, and Playboy Gary Hart versus J.J. Dillon. Ken Mantell could book a show, and as far as letting guys know where they were supposed to be, what they should be talking about, and what the finishes were, he was okay. However, he wasn't a matchmaker, he wasn't a TV producer, and when it came to creating and developing new talent and long-term direction for the company, he didn't have that capability, either. He was just picking random people hoping to get something that clicked. However, his ideas were frighteningly bad. This is a Ken Mantell classic, and also the dumbest thing I ever saw in my life. Ken brought in a young wrestler and named him Lance Von Erich, claiming he was Waldo's son. How he talked Fritz into that one, I'll never know. And if the actual idea wasn't bad enough, Ken's execution was disastrous. One day a fan came up to me and told me that he had gone to school with Ricky Vaughn. I didn't know who he was talking about, so I asked, "Who the hell is Ricky Vaughn?" The fan laughed and said it was Lance Von Erich's real name. It turned out that the kid Ken brought in for the Von Erich cousin role was a famed high school athlete from Arlington, and everyone in Texas knew he wasn't a Von Erich. When I found that out, I asked Ken, "Didn't it occur to you that as tight as the Texas wrestling scene is, everyone will know he isn't a Von Erich?" It backfired on Ken big time, and a lot of fans started cheering for wrestlers I managed against the Von Erichs, because at least I was who I said I was. A lot of fans came up to me saying that the Von Erichs were liars because they were claiming Ricky Vaughn was their cousin. It was bad, and why Ken needed another Von Erich was beyond me. That's the difference between a booker and a matchmaker. A matchmaker really gets chemistry between people and builds on that, rather than coming up with ridiculous angles and insulting the audience. I fought that mentality my whole career, though. Certain guys would say that wrestling fans are stupid, and I would always point out that they're not stupid, because if they don't like something, they'll get up and leave. Can wrestling fans be tricked? Yes. Do they like to be tricked? Yes. It's like a magic show. They want to be tricked, but don't ever look down your nose at wrestling fans and say they will buy anything we throw out there, because they won't. They'll turn the channel or quit showing up at the arena. Ken brought in some other questionable talent to Texas, as well, such as Buck Zumhoff. Ken was very lax on a lot of things, as I detailed a few paragraphs earlier when discussing drugs in the locker room, and I don't know if he didn't know any better about Buck, or if he just didn't check people out before he brought them in, because Buck had a predilection for underage girls. After Ken brought Buck in from the American Wrestling Alliance, Buck was found with a young girl living in an abandoned farmhouse that had no electricity close to Ken's place in Decatur, and was eventually sent to jail. That was yet another blemish on the Texas wrestling territory thanks to Ken's bad choices in talent. There was also a completely different mindset that had permeated throughout the territory, because Ken allowed the wrestlers to walk out among the fans and sign autographs before the matches. When I was booking, I never allowed anyone on my crew to leave the dressing room and be seen out at the snack bar where fans could talk to them and associate with them, because I know that familiarity breeds contempt. Once a wrestler is out there among the people, there is no mystery, and the fans lose respect for them. For Ken to allow a guy with a gimmick like the missing link to mingle among the people would have been as idiotic as me telling the great Kabuki, "Hey, Kabuki, why don't you go out there and get me a few hot dogs and bring me back a Coke, as well? And if you want, sign some autographs and talk to the people." Speaking of the great Kabuki, by 1985, he was back in Texas, as well. Since the great Kabuki needed a manager, and he and I as a team were kaput, Ken put him with Sunshine, which I thought was the most ridiculous thing I ever saw in my life. He took one of the most vicious and scary attractions that had ever been created and deballed him to the point that he had a 120-pound girl leading him around. In short, I was the guy who created and developed the great Kabuki, and Ken Mantell was the one who destroyed him. I shouldn't just fault Ken, though. The great Kabuki deserves some of the blame, as well. When I was managing him, I used to tell him over and over, "Whatever I give you and we develop, you have to protect, because if you don't, you'll end up where you were before, and nobody will care about you." Unfortunately, the great Kabuki was just not sophisticated enough on his own to understand who he was and what he had become. I would see the great Kabuki in the dressing room and we would talk occasionally, but I didn't do business with him, and never gave him any more suggestions on his gimmick. Of course, anytime Ken would tell him to do something preposterous, the great Kabuki would come to me and ask, "Gary-san, what do you think?" I would just tell him, "Don't do anything you don't want to do." When the great Kabuki finally left Texas, he couldn't draw 3,000 people at the Sportatorium because of what Ken did to him with Sunshine and all that silly stuff. If it wasn't for his newfound success in Japan, the great Kabuki would have been opening matches around the United States within a year. I really and truly believe that. I should give Ken a little credit, though. Jimmy Garvin and his manager Sunshine were unique. Sunshine was an adorable, sweet little girl, who everyone loved, and bringing them into Texas was one of the few good choices Ken Mantell ever made. The other bright spot of Ken's booking was when he brought in Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express. Jim added excitement to the territory that was desperately needed, and the Midnight Express had tremendous matches with the Fantastics. Not only did Jim bring a lot of energy to the territory, but he put asses in the seats. He sold a lot of tickets because he was so obnoxious that everyone wanted to come and cuss him out. I remember my first introduction to Jim. It was in 1977 while I was the booker in Dallas, and Jim was writing the programs for the Tennessee office. He called me up to see if he could interview me, and I was more than happy to oblige. Then, after he broke into the business as a manager, his character morphed into a hybrid of me and Jim Barnett. His James E. Cornette name came from James E. Barnett, and his rich mother came from the gimmick that I had used in Houston during 1973. He even called me to ask if he could use the gimmick, and of course I gave him my blessings. Jim and I always got along perfectly, and he actually reminded me of myself when I was a kid. I always had a great deal of respect for Jim Cornette, because even though he had a tremendous fear of flying, he would get on an airplane to go to every show. I saw that kid fight his fear on a daily basis, and he white-knuckled every flight. One time we were coming back from El Paso, and we hit some real turbulence. It was terrible. We were bouncing around the sky and Jim was literally freaking out. It got so bad that the plane landed in Lubbock so the pilots could check and see if anything had broken. It was that bad. Jim, Bobby Eaton, and Dennis Condrey got off the plane, rented a car, and drove to Dallas. Jim was scared to death of flying, and I always felt he was the bravest guy I ever knew. Now I should add an addendum on the credit I gave Ken Mantell for bringing in Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express, because he truly dropped the ball with them. Unfortunately, Ken felt that the Midnight Express were too small to work against Kevin and Kerry, so the obvious feud between them never took place. I didn't see it that way at all and knew that the fans would have loved to see the Von Erichs against a phenomenal team like the Midnight Express. They would have especially loved to have gotten a chance to see the boys get their hands on Jim Cornette. There is not a doubt in my mind that the Von Erich boys would have had a great run with the Midnight Express, easily as good as the one the boys had with Chris and Gino and perhaps even as good as their run with the Fabulous Freebirds. But Ken Mantell clearly didn't agree. Jim was extremely disappointed once he realized that the Midnight Express would never get a chance to face the Von Erichs. One night after a show in Dallas, Jim and I were talking about the situation, and he told me that he and the Midnight Express had an opportunity to go to the Carolinas. He knew I had been there, and asked me if I thought they would be a good fit. I encouraged him to go, because I knew they would do great in that territory, and it was clear that Ken was missing the boat with them in Texas. Jim and the Midnight Express did go and became huge stars on TBS, which by now was airing Jimmy Crockett's wrestling show. World Class Championship Wrestling was instrumental in getting them that opportunity, though. A lot of guys don't give World Class Championship Wrestling the proper credit that it deserves, but it helped a lot of major names in wrestling get their first big break and national exposure. I started attending the booking meetings, but I only did it to protect the interest of my crew, which now included Mark Lewin, Tim Brooks, and the one-man gang. Fritz would also attend some of the meetings, and I heard him say some awful things to Ken. If Ken suggested something Fritz didn't like, Fritz would bark, "That's the dumbest thing I ever heard in my life. You're the worst booker I ever had." Ken would just sit there and laugh, saying, "Okay, boss, I'll try harder." Fritz was a big, rugged, opinionated, egotistical bully, and he treated everyone like a doormat. Ken Mantell was his doormat, assistant booker David Manning was his doormat, spot show promoter Ed Watt was his doormat, and referee Rick Hazard was his doormat. Since Fritz had a need to belittle people, to control people's lives, and for people to kiss his ass, people like Ken, David, Ed, and Rick weaseled into positions that they weren't qualified for, and their main job in life was to make Fritz feel good about himself. And for some reason, and I don't know why, Fritz took pleasure in making other people look ridiculous. Fritz liked showing those in his clique that he was in charge and that he could do and act however he wanted. That was the essence of Fritz von Erich, with two exceptions, Bulldog Danny Pletches and Playboy Gary Hart. We never took anything from Fritz, and that's why we were with him for so long. We were the only two guys who he could get an honest opinion from, and the only people who ever stood up to him. Everyone else kissed his ass. I can't speak for Danny, but the reason I handled Fritz the way I did was because I never looked at him as anything other than the guy I had wrestled in Detroit and Amarillo before he was a promoter. I never had a boss mentality with him, and if he ever tried to talk down to me, I would never have allowed it, because I was never afraid of losing my job. I really didn't like going to the booking meetings because I wasn't the booker, and I didn't feel like giving my ideas or thoughts on the direction of the company. I wasn't getting paid for anything other than taking care of the wrestlers I managed, so mostly I kept my mouth shut. However, whenever I did speak up to discuss the wrestlers I managed, no matter what I would suggest, Ken would brush it off with, "That'll never work." All I would ask was, why? He would never have an answer. You would think that with my successful track record, Ken would be happy to go along with anything I brought up. However, I felt some animosity from him because he was the booker, yet I was running my own programs. That wasn't that unusual, though. I had been doing that long before I ever became a booker. That was my responsibility, to take care of the wrestlers that I managed. He was also paranoid that I was looking to get his booking job, but I didn't want it. At that time in my life I wasn't interested in being in the office at 8 o'clock every morning 5 days a week. Why would I want all that trouble and aggravation for an extra $700 when I was already making $1,200 playing with my children in the pool during the day and hanging out with my friends at night? Believe me when I tell you, I didn't want his job. If Ken would have been more open to the ideas I offered him, I would have been more than happy to help him. However, he was threatened by the tremendous success I had not only in Texas, but in other territories, as well, and didn't like the fact that I was instrumental in establishing the Von Erich Boys, Bruiser Brody, and the Fabulous Freebirds in Texas, and he really didn't like the fact that Fritz respected me for both my knowledge and the accomplishments I had in wrestling. And even though Ken thought he was a genius, he was just a booker. A lot of people have been bookers, but there are very few guys like me, Ole Anderson, Pat Patterson, Dusty Rhodes, George Scott, and Bill Watts, and I do consider myself in that very elite group, because we were the main group of high-profile, long-term, successful bookers from the 70s into the 80s. There were other bookers who were good, like Louis Tillett, George Becker, and Tom Renisto, but they would really just get a list of good guys and bad guys and put them against each other. The 6 bookers in my group truly developed and created guys, and found guys with charisma. We had a real feel for how to get money out of the business, and we also had a lot of experience. I had booked in Florida, Georgia, Texas, and North Carolina. Dusty Rhodes had booked in Florida and the Carolinas, Ole Anderson had booked both Georgia and the Carolinas, and Bill Watts had booked to Oklahoma, Georgia, and Florida. George Scott, meanwhile, had booked the Carolinas and the WWF along with Pat Patterson. Those were all big, high-profile booking jobs, and we were all very successful. Ken Mantell wasn't in our class at all, not only because he had no experience prior to Texas, but also because he didn't have the opportunity to assist someone like Ole Anderson. When I was around Bill Watts and Jim Barnett, I sucked up all their knowledge. Dusty Rhodes took every opportunity he could to learn from Eddie Graham. Ken, meanwhile, was sitting there in Texas with no experience and no insight to what the booking job entailed, and not once did he show any interest or take any initiative to pick my brain and learn how to develop and create talent. The sheer apathy he displayed is why I consider him an incompetent booker, and why he ultimately wasn't successful. By that time, even though I was no longer managing Chris and Gino, anytime they needed advice, they would come to me. One time they told me about an angle that Ken Mantell had devised for them. Chris explained, "We're going to have a match where we get our heads shaved for 90 days, but as soon as Kevin and Kerry shave our heads, we'll put masks on. Then, after our hair grows back, we'll take off the masks." I gave them my honest opinion, saying, "Boys, that's a road to disaster. You cannot advertise that you will shave your heads and keep it shaved for 90 days, and then screw all the people by coming to the ring in a mask." They were surprised that I was taking that attitude, and Gino said, "Well, we like it and Ken likes it, so that's what we're going to do. If that's what you want to do, then do it. But from my point of view, you're making a major mistake," I warned them. "As soon as you show up on TV with the masks, you'll disgust the people and lose the respect of the fans. Plus, why would anybody want to pay to see you with masks on?" They paid me no heed, and sure enough, by double-crossing the fans, their angle went right into the toilet and their program with the Von Erichs died on the vine. A short time after, some of the boys were in the dressing room talking about the Chris and Gino mask debacle, and Mark Lewin stated that it was the dumbest booking idea he had ever seen. Someone spoke up in Ken's defense and argued that Ken had done a pretty good job as booker thus far. Mark shot back, "What are you talking about? With the talent pool and angles that Gary left, a monkey could have run this place." Not long after that, I got a call from Ken Mantell, who wanted to see me in his office. I went to his office and sat down, and Ken said, "I'm going to let Mark Lewin go." "Why? What has he done?" "He was smoking marijuana behind the Will Rogers Auditorium," Ken replied. "Ken, you and I have smoked marijuana behind that building," I said incredulously. "This is now a firing offense?" "It doesn't matter what we did in the past," he said. "I have to let Mark go. Period." At that point, I was pissed. I knew that what Mark said about Ken riding on my success got back to him, and it obviously touched a nerve. Well, sometimes the truth hurts. I stood up from my chair and said, "Then if you're letting Mark go, I quit."